Hello, everyone, and welcome to a Dynamics 365 Tech Talk, where today's topic is environment planning for finance and operations projects. My name is Evan, and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this web conference through Teams live events, and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. Today's web conference is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation, and by participating in the session using Microsoft Teams, your name, email address, phone number, and/or title may be viewable by other session participants. If you do not consent to being a part of a recorded session, please disconnect at this time. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions throughout the event. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Now let's get started. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Rachel Profitt, Senior Program Manager, Peter Rio, Program Manager 2, and Rich Black, Senior Program Manager. Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Evan, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be joining us from. To take a look at what we're going to cover in today's Tech Talk from an objective standpoint, there's kind of 4 main things that we hope that you get out of this session. So one, we're going to start by describing those key concepts that are relevant to environments and the planning of your environments specific to Dynamics 365 Finance and Dynamics 365 Supply Chain Management. We're also going to discuss how to incorporate the common data service into your environment planning because now we get a CDS environment with your finance and operation apps. We're also going to help you build an environment plan that's adapted from your implementation by walking through a sample exercise. And we're also going to provide some guidance based on experiences that we've had from our actual implementations. A few things that we will not be covering in today's session are the detailed licensing aspects related to environments or the service requests and SLAs that are related to your environment management. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at the agenda of how we're going to break this down today. So we're going to start off with a glossary of terms and kind of covering why environment planning is important and what it includes. Then I'm going to hand it off to Rich, who's going to talk a little bit about our standard offer. Then we'll switch gears and Peter will go through how to get additional environments, and Rich will walk us through that sample exercise. And then I'll take a look at other considerations and recommendations, and we'll wrap up with a checklist and some additional resources you can use. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with the glossary. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about why environment planning is important and what environment planning should include. So environment planning is this process that we go through in your implementation that is to describe the details about each of the environments that you're going to need, both during your implementation and after your implementation post go live. That environment plan should be a matrix that contains the type, the topology, the deployment options, due dates, and other key information. And that might be things like the responsible person and the dates that it's required, to deploy and when it can be turned off. It's important to note that your environment plan is a living document, and it should be revisited at each of your key project milestones. Environment planning is very important in your project for several different reasons. And the first reason is that it enables the project team members to deliver their tasks. And so what we mean by that is, if you don't have an appropriate amount of development environments, one for each developer, your developers can't, do their development tasks. If you don't have proper training or testing environments, you're not going to have the right environments that your project team members and the business users need in order to complete those tasks to get you to a successful go live. The environment plan is also important because it helps clarify the upfront and potential environment costs. If you plan those environments well in detail upfront, then you'll know exactly what those costs are going to be throughout your project and when those additional funds are going to be needed. It's not uncommon that people don't plan for those environments that are needed just before go live for training and performance testing, or even up at the beginning for data migration appropriately. And then we have these extra unexpected costs in the project. So the third reason why environment planning is important is it helps us avoid project delays with the last minute discovery of a missing environment. It's not uncommon that, if you didn't plan for a performance testing environment or a training environment, that you figure these things out, right at the end of your project or right as you're needing it. And getting new environments, procuring those licenses, getting them deployed, getting all the data configured in them can oftentimes be a time-consuming process. So that's another reason why it's really important to make sure that we're taking a look at these environment plans at the beginning and then revisiting it throughout your project at the key milestones. So let's go ahead and take a look at some terms that are used to describe cloud offerings. The first term is that organization, which is really that company, and is typically identified by one or more public domains like contoso.com. The subscription goes inside of that well, I shouldn't say goes inside. It's assigned to that organization. And that subscription is really the agreement that you have with Microsoft to use those cloud platforms or services. So we have SaaS solutions like Microsoft 365 and Dynamics 365 that are both licensed on a per user basis. And then there's also different types of subscriptions for platform as a service and infrastructure as a service. And that would be like Azure services. And these types of services are cloud resource consumption based, meaning that you pay for what you use. Licenses are each of those individual specific SKUs that you're purchasing, and they allow a specific user to access that service. And those licenses do need to be assigned to each of the users. The user accounts themselves are actually stored inside of your Azure Active Directory, and you can sync your Azure Active Directory to your Active Directory domain services. That's a mouthful for me this morning. And then the last term here is the tenant. So a tenant represents an organization in your Azure Active Directory, and each Active Directory tenant is a distinct and separate tenant from other AAD tenants. So I've got a diagram that kind of shows a sample of a environment with tenants, data centers, and environments. So in this example, you can see Contoso Corporation around the outside, and that's our organization. And this organization is sitting inside of one tenant that is part of one Azure Active Directory. In this case, you can see that there are 3 data centers, one for the US, one for Japan, and a third one for Australia. And then within each of those data centers, we have different environments. And each of these environments serves different purposes. So the top row is showing common data service type environments where I would be deploying my Power Apps, my Power Automate, and just common data service databases as an example. And you'll notice that we are showing a dev, test, and prod in each of our 3 different environments in this sample. The common data service does not use LCS, so there's no LCS project that goes with that. In the middle row, we can actually see 2 different things going on. We have an HR LCS project that's used in the US data center and another one in the Australia data center. And we have a project operations project in LCS that's sitting in the Japan data center. You'll notice that the project operations has a dev, test, and prod environment, but you'll notice that the HR environments only have a sandbox and a production, and that's because we don't have development capabilities with human resources. And then along the bottom, the red triangles represent our finance and operations LCS projects. And again, we have got a dev, test, and prod. Now, this is a very simple example, and we're just using dev, test, and prod. You may need additional environments in your plant, and we'll dive into that a little bit later. But it's important to note that your single Azure Active Directory tenant can host multiple different environments in multiple different applications in multiple data centers. And so there's a lot of flexibility there in terms of how you can configure that. If you've got additional questions or want more information about how you can have multiple projects in one Azure Active Directory, we've got a link here on the bottom right-hand corner of this slide. So now I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about our finance and operations terminology. I've got 2 slides of terms that you may or may not be familiar with. If you're new to finance and operations, these might be new terms. So I'm going to kind of walk through them a little bit quickly. The first one here is environment purpose. So that environment purpose represents, why an environment exists. The examples are development, system testing, user acceptance testing, training, and so on. Each one of your environments is assigned a tier, and the tier defines the kind of properties of that environment. And we have 5 different tiers, tier 1 through tier 5. We're going to talk a little bit later on in the presentation about how to select the correct tier of environment and some differences that you'll have between tier 1 and tier 2 plus type environments. The topology of your environment represents the composition of your environment. Your topology typically is going to relate to your environment purpose, but this is actually a drop-down box that you have to select when you are configuring an environment. So the examples here are standard acceptance test or premier acceptance test. So the last one is your deployment options. So when you're deploying a tier 1 environment, you have 2 options in terms of where that environment can be hosted. Tier 1 environments can be hosted, cloud hosted in your own Azure subscription, or you can download them as a VHD. So let's go to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit more about a couple more terms specific to finance and operations. So first up, we have the standard environment. The standard environments are what you get included with your subscription when you buy the minimum 20 finance and operations licenses. And that's always going to be managed on the Microsoft subscription. So that includes your production and a sandbox environment. Add-on environments are additional environments that are added into your Microsoft subscription by a specific customer. And it's important to note that these add-on environments in the Microsoft subscription can only be a tier 2 or higher environment. We used to be able to have tier 1s, but that capability has now been removed. Cloud-hosted environments are a way to get an add-on environment or an additional environment, but these are always going to be tier 1 environments, and they're managed by either the customer or the partner, and they're deployed in the customer's Azure subscription. Those VHDs, like I said earlier, it's another way that you can deploy those tier 1 environments, and they're hosted on-premise using the VHDs that you can download from LCS. So now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about some terminology that is specific to Common Data Service. Like I said before, Common Data Service environments are included now with your finance and operations subscription. And we have some similar terms, but slightly different meanings. So important to note that we do have this concept of environment types. However, the types of environments that are available with the CDS are slightly different than with F&O. So we've got default, development, trial, production, and sandboxes. We also have this concept that is unique to the CDS called a default environment. Each tenant comes with a single default environment created, and that tenant is, or that environment is shared by all of the users within that tenant. The Azure region where your default Common Data Service environment is going to be hosted is in the Azure region that is closest to your Azure Active Directory tenant. The environment scope is another concept that's specific to CDS environments. And with this, each environment can contain either 0 or 1 CDS databases. And so it's not required that a Common Data Service have a database. You can still build Power Apps and Power Automates without a CDS database inside of an environment. But in order to use customer engagement apps or human resources apps, including like the new project operations, your Common Data Service would need a database. If you're planning to extend and build new entities or store data in that CDS, you would also need a CDS database. And the last term with the Common Data Service is the trial environments. So we have two types of trial environments, standard trial environments that are used for specific users, or maybe like a department manager, for example, to try out new features. There's also a subscription-based trial that is used for organizations at a larger scale to prototype or build out a proof of concept. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Rich, who's going to talk a little bit about our standard offer.
Thank you, Rachel. So when we refer to the standard offer, what we're talking about is the environments and the capacities that are included with your subscriptions. Now, first and foremost, with your finance and operations subscription, you will receive a production environment. And there's going to be one production environment or instance per tenant in most implementations. And this environment is going to be a highly robust and distributed environment that is architected, incorporating disaster recovery and high availability capabilities. In addition to the production environment, you'll also receive one sandbox environment. And this sandbox environment is going to be of the standard acceptance testing deployment topology. You'll get this standard acceptance testing tier 2 environment for the life of the tenant. And it's important to note that this is a non-production environment, but it is logically similar to the way that the production environment is architected. This sandbox environment is suitable for use as an acceptance testing environment or an integration testing environment, possibly a training environment for many implementations, but it might not be suitable for all of those purposes for your implementation, depending on the level of complexity, the number of users, the volume of activity and transactions. And so therefore, in addition to that one sandbox environment that's included with your subscription, you can also purchase additional sandbox instances as optional add-ons at different points throughout your implementation. Now, Peter's going to tell us a lot more about these additional instances, but the key takeaway for us at this moment is that the sandboxes that you acquire as add-ons, those are deployed to the Microsoft subscription, and those are going to be your tier 2, 3, 4, or 5 type environments. Alternatively, you can also choose to deploy a number of single server environments, and we'll call those cloud-hosted environments. You'll see the abbreviation CHE in many places as well. Those cloud-hosted environments are deployed to customer-managed Azure subscriptions. Now, for more information on what is included in your subscription for finance and operations applications, check out the Microsoft Dynamics 365 licensing guide. It's linked here. It goes into a great deal of detail about the specifics. And among those specifics, it also includes detailed information on the SQL and file storage capacity that is included. The numbers that are shown here at the right are the basic capacities that are included with every subscription. However, based on the quantity of user licenses that you've acquired, these volumes may be increased. There's a formula for which these are incremented based on the user volume. And in addition to that programmatic increase, you can also optionally purchase add-ons in 1 GB increments for either file storage or SQL storage capacity. So now let's take a look at the standard components that are included in the Common Data Service subscription. So with your F&O licensing, with your finance and operations applications, you will receive one Common Data Service instance that can be used as a production instance for Common Data Service or the Common Data Service. If you have a HR subscription, you'll also receive one CDS environment that's intended to be used for production. And as we mentioned with the finance and operations environments, these production instances are architected incorporating disaster recovery capabilities across different Azure geographic regions and including high availability capabilities. Now, your production environment can link to an existing Common Data Service, or you can deploy a new one depending on how many instances you do end up acquiring and what your specific implementation timeline and methodology looks like. But in addition to those production instances of CDS that are included with your F&O and or HR subscriptions, you also have the option to acquire and deploy CDS sandboxes. Now, you'll get one specific sandbox that's included with a human resources subscription. That's in addition to the one that's intended for use as production. But for other purposes, you can acquire sandboxes as additional add-ons. Now, if you only have an F&O subscription, remember that you get one CDS instance included. It is possible, and many customers will use that specific CDS instance as a sandbox initially and later convert it to production. Generally speaking, though, the sandbox environment that is associated with a human resources subscription is a non-production environment. And again, you can purchase additional CDS environments, and the CDS environments that you require might also be dependent upon licensing for other products, such as sales, marketing, project operations, and so forth. Now, in addition to your production environment and your sandbox environments, you'll also want to acquire some development environments, and these would be add-ons. The number that you'll require will vary depending on the amount of extension and development that'll be done on your project. Generally speaking, these development environments may be linked with finance and operations environments, corresponding finance and operations environments. Similar to finance and operations development environments, we do recommend that you deploy one of these instances for each developer, and of course that you remember that these are non-production environments. Again, additional information on this subject is located in that same Microsoft Dynamics 365 licensing guide. And in addition to these instances that are incorporated with your subscriptions, for the Common Data Service, there's also a concept of request limits and allocations. And this is to protect the service from runaway transaction volumes. And you can, depending on your needs, tailor these service protection limits by acquiring additional capacity. So like the SQL and file storage capacity that's included with your finance and operations subscription, you have database file and log capacity that is included with your Common Data Service subscription, and additional capacity can be purchased for those as well. Typically, these capacities and limits, these will be discussed during your implementation once you get a very clear idea of the nature of your solution and the volume of the activity and transactions, and how exactly you're going to be using the Common Data Service or the related components here. And once you have that clear idea, you can determine if any of these limits will be applicable to you and if any additional capacity is warranted. Next, let's talk about what we do with these environments that are included with our subscription. So first, we'll talk about provisioning the production environment. And a production environment has a number of characteristics before we can deploy it, a number of prerequisites for deploying the production environment. So the production environment is deployed after the subscription estimator or the usage profile is completed. We'll use those terms interchangeably. But the subscription estimator and the usage profile is essentially your estimate of the transaction volume and the level of activity that you'll be using the environment for. You'll populate that in the LCS project. We'll use that to inform our sizing for deployment of that environment. Additionally, performance testing needs to be done before the production environment can be deployed, and we will be able to review the performance testing telemetry data. Once that telemetry data is available, we can also incorporate that into our planning. You, of course, have access to this performance testing telemetry data through LCS, through the Environment Monitoring tab. And in addition, in the pre-production environments, you can also leverage the SQL Query Store to gain additional insight into performance metrics for your pre-production environments. In addition to those two prerequisites, all finance and operations projects need to complete a go-live readiness checklist. And we use that checklist to prepare an assessment report for every implementation. That assessment report will be delivered and reviewed with you. And once that's completed and approved, and the customer has signed off on a number of the key activities, including UAT and the solution in general, then the production environment can be requested and deployed. And it's important to note that the production environment that's deployed on the Microsoft subscription has access to the servers and services that it includes that are limited to the dynamic service engineers. So you don't have remote desktop access or any form of administrative access to these environments. They're very tightly controlled and secured. Now, once your production environment is deployed, it can be used to do a final round of validation. And we strongly recommend that you take the opportunity to get the production environment deployed and perform a mock cutover and do that final round of validation. However, we will draw a line and distinguish that from performing actual testing in the production environment. Validation, more extensive validation, acceptance testing, performance testing, and various other types of testing should absolutely be done in a tier 2, 3, 4, 5 environment prior to deploying production as part of your preparation and readiness for moving to production. Again, with production being a highly available and highly secured environment, it is not the ideal place to open the hood and to begin working underneath the hood there. To help facilitate the use of production for mock cutovers and for performing that final round of validation, remember that you can use what we call a point-in-time restore, sometimes abbreviated as a PITR. So you can roll back the production environment to an earlier backup based on a 28-day retention period for production environments. And you can also use this point-in-time restore capability to move the data from the production environment to one of the other sandbox environments on the Microsoft subscription. And again, high availability and disaster recovery capabilities, of course, are part of every production environment. Across the bottom, again, we've got these prerequisites for production deployment in a sequential order here. And again, to briefly summarize these, you'll complete your usage profile and subscription estimator contained in the LCS project. We'll review the performance testing and telemetry data from your performance testing activities. The go live readiness checklist will be submitted, and the assessment will then be prepared and shared with you, and we'll reach mutual agreement on the readiness there. At that point, the production environment can be requested, sized, and deployed. Thereafter, again, we strongly encourage that you perform a mock cutover and do a final round of validation there before using the point-in-time restore capability to roll that back and or re-execute your cutover activities and actually go live. But before we can get there, and before we do all of this, of course, we're going to use our sandbox environment that's included with our subscription, as well as any additional ones that we've acquired. So let's talk about deploying and provisioning these sandbox environments. So your standard sandbox environment that's included with the subscription, again, is a tier 2 standard acceptance test environment that is a topology similar to production. This environment is provisioned during the onboarding process, so it's really available to you right from the get-go. And you can choose whether or not to have this deployed with demo data or a blank database. Most customers will opt to include this initially, to deploy this initially with a demo data set. Now, because this is on the Microsoft subscription, this is not accessible using RDP. And again, access to the services and servers in the Microsoft subscription is limited to the dynamic service engineers. However, as I mentioned, you do have insight into the metrics applicable to this environment through LCS environment monitoring and through SQL just-in-time access. Now you can also roll back these sandbox environments, the standard sandbox environment, using the point-in-time restore capability. But it's important to note that the retention period for backups for the sandbox environment is limited to 7 days as compared to 28 days for a production environment. Now, similarly, you have a CDS sandbox available to you with an F&O subscription, and that CDS sandbox can be deployed on demand. And again, this one that's included with F&O can be used as a sandbox and converted to production later. But one important consideration for your CDS sandboxes and for CDS applications in general is that you want to deploy, to the greatest extent possible, you want to deploy your CDS environments and instances to the same region as where your finance and operation applications are going to be running. To help you navigate which services and applications are available in which specific Azure regions, there's a number of links here that provide additional information on that and help you determine where the ideal location to host your services might be. So if we take a look at a tool that we recommend that all implementation teams use during the implementation process. Here we can see an example of AzureSpeed.com, which enables us to see the average latency to any of the data centers for Azure in real time. So this is absolutely recommended to be used at some point during the implementation to confirm that the latency is acceptable to the locations that where your end users might be located, and that you're balancing the needs of all of the end users across all of your different locations when selecting the ideal location to deploy your applications and services. Now, when you're working through your implementation process, it is possible to deploy various different environments and instances to different regions, and you can do this to validate and confirm that your selection is ideal and is correct. However, you should deploy each of these environments to the same region as your production environment. So you might, over the course of your implementation, decide to change the deployment region, and that's perfectly okay. But by the time you're ready to go to production, you should have this location selected, confirmed, validated, and have your other environments actually redeployed to that same region. So next, let's step through a deployment process and see just how easy it is to deploy or redeploy an environment on demand. And in this example, what we'll see is an LCS project in which we're going to deploy a new environment. In this example, we're going to do a cloud hosted environment. We're going to deploy it to my own Azure subscription here. The ID is blanked out there, but once the Azure subscription is specified there in the project settings, then we can simply go into the environments tab here. We can select our version as well as other characteristics of the environment that we want to deploy and click through to select the type of environment in terms of the deployment topology and subtype or subtopology for this environment. In this case, we're going to deploy an environment we intend to use for development purposes. I'm going to specify a unique environment name that provides some information, some clue as to what this environment is going to be used for. Remember, these are easy to deploy and redeploy, so you can change these when you redeploy them. Most importantly, we're going to select the SKU, and then we're going to select some different characteristics of this environment. One of the most common characteristics that we want to select from and choose and verify during deployment is whether or not we're going to include demo data or start with a blank data set. Once we do that, we will confirm our selections. We'll have another opportunity to review the Azure price list and confirm that the virtual machine size for this all-in-one development environment is appropriate. And then we'll go ahead and deploy our environment. You'll see that it moves to a queued status, and shortly thereafter, it'll move to a deploying status. We can go ahead and click into this environment and view additional details. Because it is in the process of moving from queued and then to deploying, we don't have all of the characteristics or details available here, but you get a sense as to the details that you can see here. Now, the example that we've just stepped through here is a cloud hosted environment, a tier 1 environment that is deployed to a customer owned subscription. However, this deployment process is similar for other environment types as well. The selection, the options that you'll choose during deployment will vary slightly depending on what type of environment it is. So next, I'm going to hand it over to Peter, who's going to tell us a little bit more about these additional environments and how to acquire them.
Thank you, Rich. All right, next, let's take a look at a sample. So this is a sample of F&O and CDS environment plan for two different types of projects. So less complex project and more complex project. So let's look at the F&O first. As the standard cloud offer only includes two F&O environments, Tier 2 and production, which is not sufficient for an implementation project. So you need to plan for additional environments based on what kind of tests and activities that need to be conducted. So for the less complex project, you may use standard Tier 2 sandbox for the test and the training. As for the development environment, you will need to consider Tier 1 environment, which has Visual Studio installed for writing code, because same Tier 1 environment couldn't be shared by multiple developers at the same time. So make sure you have the same number of Tier 1 environment as the same number of the developers. For example, if you have 3 developers, then you need to have 3 development environments. The source code developed in development environment is synced to Azure DevOps. The build process synchronizes the source code from Azure DevOps onto the build VM and produce deployable package that you can apply to sandbox and production environment. The build VM is also a Tier 1 environment, and there is a new feature that the build activity can be done using Microsoft hosted agent. Means can take away the need of the build VM. But this feature is limited to code compile and creating package only. There is no support for running unit test, and there is overall time limit per month. So please make sure that you assess those limitations and decide whether to use build VM or Microsoft hosted agents. For the other environments, you may need to have a golden configuration environment to store and move configuration across environments. A migration environment to migrate data from legacy system, and a higher tier environment for performance testing. And if we look at the more complex project, you may need more development machines and more testing environments, or a higher tier based on a number of users and the transaction volume. Later on, we will talk about more about how to choose a right tier. And if you use CDS together with your F&O environment through such as dual write or virtual entity, because it doesn't support one-to-many mapping between CDS and F&O environment. So you need to consider the environment planning with the mapping between F&O and CDS environment. Depends on what kind of license you have. In case that only one CDS is included in your F&O subscription, then you can switch CDS types between sandbox and production. But if you need more CDS environment, then you need to consider to purchase. As for development, you can use development type of CDS because it's free. For build and golden configuration, you can see here it's for F&O environment. So as those are only for F&O purpose, so there's no need to have CDS environment for those. But you need to consider whether to use the CDS for data migration. If it's necessary to migrate data separately into F&O and CDS, depends on the large data volume, then you need to consider a dedicated CDS to migrate data between CDS environment using the OData connector. For the other testing environments, you also need to consider dedicated CDS environments connected to F&O environments to test end-to-end scenarios. So you see here, there are many types of environments in F&O side, right? So sandbox tier 1 to tier 5 and production environment. In CDS side, you can see there are development, sandbox, and production type of environment. So who is responsible for those environment management? Next, let's talk about the environment responsibility. So basically, except F&O tier 1 environment, all the other F&O tier 2 to tier 5 and production environment and all the CDS environments are managed by Microsoft. This means Microsoft is responsible for the infrastructure management, for example, applying security patch to your OS or maintaining the OS. For tier 1 environment, which is deployed and managed by customer or partner, either hosted in your local data center or your own Azure subscription, because you have full control to those environments. So you are responsible to maintain those tier 1 environments. And for Microsoft managed F&O environment, self-service deployment is now available for some of the customers, and the number of new customers who have access to self-deployment feature will gradually increase. So next, let's talk about more about the self-service deployment. So you can check the environment type in LCS to see whether your environment is self-service or not. So for the customers who are using self-service capabilities, there are no longer lead time or wait time for deployment. So deployment can be completed within an average time of 30 minutes. And you will no longer have remote desktop access to the environment. All the operations that need RDP are now available as self-service actions in LCS. For example, the procedure to copy a F&O database from SQL Server to Azure SQL database environment is now available as a service. And the others like diagnostics capabilities for troubleshooting, etc. And you can use just-in-time access feature to access your SQL database. And you will need to provide a combined deployable package for customizations. It means all the customizations, including the ISVs, must be deployed as a single deployment package. You will not be able to deploy one module at a time. And for SSRS report, customer fonts are no longer supported, and the business logic defined using Visual Basic script embedded in SSRS is not supported. So please pay attention to those limitations, because you can develop those features and run in your tier 1 environment, but it doesn't work in your self-service enabled sandbox and production. So next, let's talk about more about difference between tier 1 and tier 2 above environment. One important thing you need to realize is tier 1 has different architecture comparing to other sandboxes and production environment. Tier 1 is one box environment, means all the components, including application server, SQL server, and other services are installed on same server. But for the other sandboxes, from tier 2 to tier 5 and also production environment, all the components are installed on multiple servers. And the database is Azure SQL, not SQL Server. So the tests, especially like UAT and performance testing, should not be done on tier 1, because it may have different behavior in production environment. Just like we said, if you use customer code in SSRS report, it works in tier 1, but doesn't work in self-service enabled sandbox or production environment. So please make sure you use tier 2 above sandbox for UAT and the higher tier for performance testing. So later we will discuss how to choose a suitable tier for testing and the other purposes. And the tier 1 has all the components in storing one box, because the main purpose is to maximize the efficiency for the developer. And the tier 1 has two different ways to deploy. You can choose either to host the tier 1 in your own Azure subscription as a cloud-hosted environment, or you can download the VHD to host the VHD as a tier 1 locally or in your data center. Okay, next, let's compare the two different deployment options for tier 1. Generally speaking, there are many limitations to use VHD, like the public URL is not supported, means you couldn't access the F&O service from outside of the VHD, and several manual tasks need to be done, including applying the deployable package. The main advantage is you can leverage your existing local data center or PC to host the VHD. But if we look at the cloud hosted, there is no such kind of limitations. But it's not free, because that needs to host in your own Azure subscription and charge you by usage. For example, if the environment running for 8 hours, then you need to pay for 8 hours. But you can turn off the VM when you don't use it to save money. Okay, next let's talk about how to choose a correct tier, so tier 2 above. For the testing and the other purposes like training and data migrations, etc. So for those purposes, it's important that you choose a correct tier 2 or higher environment to conduct those activities. Basically, the more users or transactions that need to be handled in 1 hour, the higher tier you need to consider to use. For example, performance testing needs to simulate day-in-the-life usage. So both the number of the users and the transaction volume are high. But if we look at data migration, it may not have so many users to log into the environment, but need to handle large transaction volume. So it depends on what kind of tasks and activities need to be conducted in that environment. You need to select the suitable tier based on the specific scenarios and the factors such as number of users, complexity, and transaction volume. So here you can look, here is the baseline that can help you to justify the correct tier for any of the purposes, like including the data migration, training, UAT, etc. For the transaction volume, after you upload a subscription estimator and mark it as active in LCS, the total transaction volume will be calculated automatically, and you can view the result of the transaction lines per hour in LCS, and based on that transaction volume to choose correct tier. So next, let's see how to choose environment for CDS. As for CDS environment, how you choose to use the environment depends on your organization and the applications you are trying to build. This is one example of environment strategy that you can use a single environment for individual developers to do some training or proof of concept at the beginning of the project, or you can use dedicated environment for critical or ERP scale projects from development to the test and then release to production for end users. Or you can create multiple sets of dev environment by different business units that come together in central test and production environment. Okay, now I'm going to hand it over to Rich to walk you through a sample exercise.
All right, thank you, Peter. So we're going to step through a sample exercise here. And we're going to make some hypothetical assumptions here as if we are just embarking on an implementation journey and we are very early in our implementation project. So this is, of course, the ideal time to create an environments plan. And there's a number of steps that we'll want to keep in mind that will help us build this plan. We're going to refer to a spreadsheet I'll show you in just a moment here, and we'll make this spreadsheet available to you for download along with this recording and this slide deck. But when we're creating the plan and we're working through the spreadsheet that we'll look at shortly, here are the key steps that we'll work through. First, we're going to, at a high level, define the project timeline and the milestones, get the basic structure of our implementation schedule. Then we're going to review that plan, make another pass at it, and we're going to add the activities that require a supporting environment. And at this point in time, we're going to pay particular attention to those activities that require a dedicated supporting environment, i.e., we might not be able to conduct multiple activities in the same environment at the same time. Based on those considerations, then we're going to make yet another pass at this plan and determine some of the specifics for each of these environments, what specific purposes and intents these environments are going to be used for will help us determine the appropriate deployment option, topology, and other details. Finally, after reviewing those 3 steps there, we're going to summarize the list of environments we've determined to be required in a matrix. We'll be able to share that with our implementation team. And when we review that with the team in conjunction with the project schedule, then next we'll confirm our procurement plans for these additional environments. We'll need to make sure that we make these available to the team for their required purposes before they're actually necessary. And finally, things change, right? So it's important that we revisit this plan regularly and do so at key milestones throughout the implementation. Now, let's consider some sample parameters or hypothetical considerations for our project. In this example, we are, as Contoso Corporation, we're implementing Dynamics 365 Finance, Supply Chain Management, Human Resources, and a number of Power Apps. We are going to be conducting some training sessions. We're going to do those early on at the outset of the project in the analysis phase. And then, of course, we're going to be conducting more in-depth training for both train the trainer as well as end users in the deployment phase. We're going to have a number of developers working on custom development and extensions. We're going to have 3 developers from the partner, and at least 2 of those developers will also be working with Power Apps. In addition to that, we're going to have a strategic ISV who will bring in an additional developer at a key point in the implementation. In terms of data, we've identified a need to track our configuration data, our golden configuration, in a separate environment, one that we can keep secure and make sure that it is maintained transaction-free. And we'll also be working on data migration. The customer, Contoso in this instance, in this scenario, is going to work on data migration with guidance from their partner throughout the implementation from the outset out through the duration of the implementation. We're going to conduct some performance testing. We're going to do that in parallel to the final user acceptance testing. And as a final consideration here, we are going to use dual write for the integration between finance and operations and human resources. So let's take a look at an environment plan. And first, let's start with the end product and the output. So this is our environment plan sample that is the result of stepping through those steps, those 6 steps that I outlined previously. Before we go through those steps together, let's just take a quick look at the output here and see what we've come up with. What we've created here is a list of environments that we've identified with a specific ID. We've listed the purpose of each of these environments, We've defined the deployment option that is ideal for this environment of this purpose. We've further clarified the specific topology that is applicable to that environment. We've identified in this case a project owner, I'm sorry, not a project owner, but an environment owner for these environments who will be responsible for maintaining this environment, maintaining access to it and availability, and ensuring that, that it is used for the intended purpose. We've identified the licensing vehicle that we'll use to acquire and procure and deploy this environment. And we've also identified by a number here, this is the week number in the project, at which point we will need to have the environment available for our implementation team to make use of. And then finally, we've also taken into consideration whether or not this environment is going to be around for the long term and whether it must be maintained following go live. So let's take a look at the various steps, and let's start at the beginning. Remember, the first step in creating our environment plan was to take a high-level summary, to make a high-level summary of our project timeline and our project milestones. So here you can see that across the horizontal axis, we've got our timeline with our week numbers. And then along the vertical axis, we've listed the various phases of our implementation. Now, of course, depending on your implementation methodology, your specific definition of the phases and terminology might vary slightly. That's perfectly fine. You go ahead and fill out what's appropriate here. But the idea is that you should be able to map those phases and the activity that they contain to a project timeline here. You can see that we've defined our go live as occurring during the 23rd week of the year there in early June. So for the second step in our process, move to the next tab here, we've fleshed this out a little bit further. We've added additional detail to most of the phases here to define what types of activities are going to occur during those phases. And we've indicated here with the colored lines and the X's how long this type of activity is going to take. One of the requirements or criteria that we defined in the scenario, remember, was that we're going to conduct some training sessions, for example, early on in the implementation. And we're going to conduct training sessions later on during deployment. So you can see those two training activities are defined here. And with each of the activities that we've listed for these various phases, what we've tried to do here is identify which of these activities, which of these implementation processes require a dedicated environment that would require an environment specifically allocated to that purpose for a specific duration of time. Once we've done that, we'll move on to the next step, and we'll further clarify additional detail for each of those environments. And you'll see that during this process, one thing that we've also done is we've identified the ongoing needs following go live for some of these environments. And we've taken into consideration here that we are going to periodically maybe deploy some additional minor extensions. And we're also going to accommodate some periodic updates. And this could be the Microsoft continuous updates. This could be some updates to our own extensions. But for those purposes, we'll need a development environment that has been deployed in Azure. And so remember, we'll be turning this off for these periods when it's not necessary and therefore not incurring any charges. We'll also need to conduct some build activities during that point in time. And we'll need to conduct some test activities. Now, for each of these activities, we've identified here the environment, deployment, and topology type, and we've gone ahead and we've assigned an environment ID. And as you'll see, because we have different activities occurring at different points in the implementation, some of these environments might be listed twice. So for example, we have the test activity, or I'm sorry, we have a test environment that is used for a couple of different purposes, but it's actually the same environment. Our CLI test environment is actually going to be used for initial training sessions for the first couple of weeks. Then we're going to repurpose, potentially redeploy that environment and use it for a slightly different purpose thereafter. Similarly, you can see that our UAT environment is going to be used for some testing purposes for user acceptance testing at the indicated point in time there during April and May. But it's also going to be used for some training sessions thereafter. We've also indicated here which environments we need from not only an F&O perspective, but also from a CDS perspective. And you can see that we've tried to indicate here which of these CDS and F&O environments are actually linked and which are dependent on each other. Remember that one of the characteristics of our scenario here is that we're going to have a couple of developers who are working not only on F&O, but also on developing some Power Apps. So they're going to be working in environments that have both F&O and an F&O instance, as well as a CDS instance available to them. And those will be linked up. Similarly, we'll be linking our test environment with a CDS test environment for the purposes of our integration testing. We'll be doing the same for process testing, UAT, performance testing, training, and of course, production. So now that we've taken a look at all of the details of our environment plan here, let's go back and look at the matrix and realize that we performed this analysis very early in our implementation, and we made some assumptions. And there are a couple of things that we weren't entirely sure of. So a couple of things that I want to call out here as options that you'll commonly need to consider and maybe determine what's the best solution for your specific implementation. One example is what you want to do with your golden configuration environment. So this is the environment, again, that we're going to use to track configuration information, settings, parameters, and so forth. We have the option of using a cloud-hosted tier 1 environment to do that, which is, the most cost-effective option. But we alternatively could choose to use a tier 2 environment for that purpose. Now, on this implementation, what we've opted to do at this early phase in planning is to get started using a tier 1 environment for that purpose if we need it this early on. But we've identified that because we have some medium complexity integration requirements and the need to move this configuration data between our various Azure SQL instances on a fairly frequent basis, that it might be more efficient for our team to do so if they are doing so from a tier 2 environment. If you remember from Peter's earlier descriptions, the tier 2 environments do use Azure SQL. And so when we are moving a database from a tier 1 environment into a tier 2, there is a database conversion process. However, when we're moving it between tier 2 environments, tier 2 and above environments, it is a self-service operation that can be completed on demand. Another consideration that you'll want to take into account is what you're going to do with your build environment. Now, for our project here, we've opted to go ahead and deploy a cloud-hosted environment that we will use for a build virtual machine. We're going to go ahead and choose to do that in this case because we would like to have the flexibility to incorporate some automation for our unit tests, as well as go ahead and make sure that we perform a database synchronization in that environment whenever we're creating a build. Alternatively, for a implementation of potentially less complexity, it might be perfectly appropriate for you to leverage the hosted build agents that are included in your Azure DevOps subscription for a specific number of minutes at no charge. You can add additional build agents or additional capacity there if required, but there are some limitations there. Specifically, you're unable to perform automated unit tests or database synchronizations using those build agents. So you'll have to evaluate which of those two options is appropriate for your implementation. And then the last thing that I want to draw your attention to on our completed plan here is that those are considerations that we made early on in the implementation. But one of the most important things to remember about preparing and using this environment plan is that we want to go back and we want to periodically revisit this plan, and we want to do so at key milestones to make sure that the considerations and assumptions and determinations that we made when initially developing the plan are still accurate and that they still match the timeline. So one of the considerations that we had made during our early planning procedures here was that we are going to conduct our training sessions shortly before go live here in week 20, sorry. We're going to conduct those training sessions in our UAT environment, and our UAT environment is going to be used for UAT shortly before that. In fact, immediately before that. So this is a potential challenge for our project in the sense that if our UAT testing is not concluded or is for some reason delayed, that can have an adverse impact to our training schedule, because it's unlikely that you can conduct acceptance testing and training in the same environment at the same time. Therefore, we need to keep a close eye on the status and the progress of our user acceptance testing when we have a dependency on the environment there, and we intend to use the same environment for those activities. If the schedule changes, this plan may need to change as well. So again, this spreadsheet will make this available to you along with this recording and the slide deck. And at this point, I will hand it back over to Rachel, who is going to discuss some additional considerations and recommendations.
Thanks, Rich. So I want to get started by talking a little bit about kind of the process for purchasing add-on environments. So it's easy oftentimes for organizations to kind of underestimate the amount of time it takes and the steps in the process. So we're going to review that here. The first thing you're going to need to do when you need to purchase an add-on is identify the SKU. You can get a list of the SKUs and a quote from either your licensing reseller or your CSP. If you're on an enterprise agreement or an EA, you would use your LSR. Otherwise, you would use your CSP. Once you've got that list, you're going to want to go through that and use the quote that was provided to identify each of the SKUs and the quantity information. And you're going to use the usage information, the number of users, order line SKUs, capacity, and so on to determine what licenses will be required based on the environment plan that you put together. Once you've defined that, then you're ready to go ahead and place your order. So you'll place that order with your LSR or your CSP for each of the SKUs that you identified in the quantities. And that order will be fulfilled by adding those SKUs either to your EA or to your subscription. And those add-ons will appear inside of your Microsoft 365 admin portal and inside of your LCS project. Once those licenses appear inside of LCS and the order is fulfilled, then you will have the ability to go ahead and deploy. And those add-ons are configured directly from LCS. If you don't have an Azure subscription, of course, you'll need to add that Azure subscription and link it to your LCS first. And we do recommend that you work closely with your CSP or your licensing reseller. Add-on environments can be purchased on a monthly basis through either MPSA if you're on an EA or directly through your CSP. And make sure that you're taking into consideration the potential lead time, the amount of time it takes to go back and forth with your LSR or your CSP. You might even want to ask them kind of if they have a specific lead time that it takes for them to provide quotes and to fulfill orders. So a couple of additional considerations that you'll want to think about your common data service add-ons. So when you need to deploy additional CDS environments, it's controlled by capacity. And there are three different types of capacity. There's the database, the file, and the log. So the database is your actual transactions if you have an actual database in your CDS. If you don't, then we don't have database capacity. We have our file capacity, which is like, you know, similar to finance and operations where we have attachments on our records. And then we have our log capacity. And so each of these three you know, types of capacity need to have enough capacity in order for you to deploy a new environment. New environments are deployed directly in the Power Platform Admin Center, and that's also where you can view what your current capacity is at. The user licenses that are assigned in Microsoft 365 Admin Portal is what controls whether or not a user has the security in order to create a new CDS environment. At a minimum of 1 GB of available capacity is required to deploy. However, I will point out there are additional considerations from a CDS environment standpoint. So if you're using customer engagement apps, there are additional licensing requirements that are specific to customer engagement. And you get multiple environments with your subscription with customer engagement as well. If you're hooking up F&O with customer engagement apps for dual write, for example. So you'll need to consider that. You might have additional environments available to you for that. And there are different rules that are in place in terms of how to get CE environments. If you're just using an environment for, you know, Power Apps or Power Automate, and there's no database inside of it, then this kind of rule would apply and you can deploy those additional environments. When you need additional environments, you're not actually buying an environment, you're buying capacity. If you do have a database in your environment, let's say it's 20 gigabytes, your default subscription comes with 20 gigabytes. And if you need to copy that data into a test, right, you would need a total of 21 gigabytes available in order to make that copy. So you'll need to consider the size of your database when you're copying that and making copies for dev, test, and prod, and so on, to make sure that you're managing that capacity carefully. There are a couple of links on the bottom of this slide, which we will be providing those decks for you with the recording, that talks a little bit more about multiple environments or multiple tenants. There's also a link here that will walk you through the process of how to actually create and manage your environments. That includes viewing your capacity information. There's a link here that's specific about storage capacity, how to view that, what it all means. And then the last link is specific to how the add-ons work and how to get capacity add-ons for your common data service. So obviously your specific situation will kind of change exactly what you need here. But you'll need to consider carefully, you know, how much data is in that CDS and how many environments you might need. So now I'm going to go ahead and switch gears and talk a little bit about the do's and the don'ts. We've separated these do's and don'ts out to F&O specific, CDS specific, and then some general environment planning do's and don'ts. So starting with our finance and operations environment, some things to do when you're planning environments. Do make sure that you're planning to use your standard acceptance testing environment that's included with your subscription. We always recommend that you deploy your environments using an unnamed or a service account. Don't use, you know, Rachel Profitt at, you know, Microsoft.com. Because if you that specific named user leaves your organization, they're still linked in the administrator of that environment. Make sure that you're assigning owners as well. So this is, you know, going to be part of your environment plan and making sure that those owners understand what their role is in environment planning as well. You'll want to also make sure that you configure the notifications for the LCS users. So when we service environments for finance and operations apps, the notifications about those environment servicings are sent out to specific users that are marked to receive notifications inside of LCS. So make sure that the appropriate users within your organization do have those. And make sure that you're deploying one tier 1 environment for each developer. So you don't, you know, on our don'ts, the first one here is don't allocate multiple developers to a single environment. Another thing not to do is to plan on using your production environment as a non-production environment. It is not intended to perform UAT or performance testing or another, any non-production like activities. In fact, we do require that you do a performance test. Can we go back? I'm not done with that slide, sorry. We do require that you complete a performance test before you can even request your production environment. Also, do not plan to use a cloud-hosted environment for your performance testing or your UAT. You'll want to make sure that you're using a Microsoft hosted environment, and you'll need to consider the size, the tier of that. And Peter talked a little bit about that earlier in the presentation on how to pick the right size of environment that's going to be needed based on your specific needs. Also, don't give all of the LCS users in your LCS project access to manage environments. That's just asking for someone to accidentally delete an environment who maybe doesn't know. And make sure that you're monitoring and kind of reviewing the LCS user access on a regular basis, because you can very quickly kind of screw up a project and delete environments and things like that that you wouldn't necessarily want everyone in your organization to do. Also, it should go without saying, but we put it here anyways, but it's not appropriate to go live on a sandbox or a development environment. The only environment that is appropriate to go live on is your production environment. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at our do's and don'ts for CDS environments. Do make sure that you're creating separate environments for dev, test, and prod. Obviously, again, depending on your specific needs, what you're developing with your CDS and how you're using your CDS, if it's being used with customer engagement apps or dual write, you'll need to carefully consider how those environments link and map to each other. And that leads us to our second recommendation, is to make sure that you're defining the purpose and the mapping between each of your CDS environments and your F&O environments. So, and I recommend using a good naming standard as well, so that the linkage between those environments is obvious. We also recommend that you rename the default environment. So like we talked about earlier, that default environment is included with your tenant and it is named default, and we recommend that it be renamed. Typically, we recommend something, if you're not sure what to name it, something like personal productivity would be a good example of what you might rename that to. Some things not to do with your CDS environment. Don't plan to use a single CDS environment for all of your different activities for dev, test, and prod. I think if you're putting everything into, just like we don't recommend, a single environment for dev, test, and prod with F&O, you wouldn't really want to do the same thing with your CDS environments. You'll want to consider carefully what makes the most sense for your project, and if there's intense data migration, you might want a separate data migration environment. Also, don't create a database in your environment unless there's actually a need for the database. So if you're not planning to use dual write or virtual entities, or extend and build Power Apps where you need to store data in a database, don't create that database. It's taking up unnecessary space, and it could create additional risk in your project as well. And don't allow all of the users in your organization to create new environments. Again, that's controlled by the access that the license that you assign to the users inside of Microsoft 365. So taking a look next at some of the do's and don'ts that are just more general around environment planning. So some things to make sure that you're doing, and we've said it multiple times. I think all three of us have said it more than once. We're just going to say it again. Plan environments early and schedule recurring reviews. So do it early, do it often. It doesn't end after you go live either. Especially if you're kind of new to like hosting environments in a cloud hosted environment on your own Azure subscription. We've heard a lot of concerns around cost and so on. Planning regular environment reviews and making sure that you have a good governance process in place can help you control those costs. Make sure that you do define a naming standard. You don't want to name all of your environments such that they're not easy to recognize. That adds undue risk to your project that people might be in the wrong environment. For example, name gold. Make sure that it's included in the name. Make sure that test is included in your testing environments. Don't just name things the name of your company 01, 02, and 03. If you're going to go with a kind of cute or clever naming scheme, I've seen a lot of organizations do that based on the products that you sell. Just make sure that you have good documentation for your users so they understand what each of those environments is used for. And then make sure that you're planning your environment update schedule. So when exactly are you going to be updating each of these different types of environments? And that kind of plays a little bit into your ALM. But once you have the list of environments, you need to make sure that you have a plan in place to get all of those environments up to the latest version in a sequence and a pattern that makes sense with your project plan. And that applies post go live as well. Things not to do from a general environment planning standpoint. Don't create a plan at the beginning and then never review it again. That won't be ideal, and that is almost assuredly going to lead to unexpected costs, additional environments, and so on. Make sure that you don't deploy your CDS and your F&O environments in different geographies. You're going to want to make sure that, if F&O is deployed here in the US, like West US, for example, you would probably want your CDS in West US as well, not sitting over in West Europe. And then the kind of last don't here is don't deploy your dev and test in a different geo than your production. So this is kind of across the board, whether it's F&O or CDS or CE or whatever your environments are. Make sure that you're using the same geography, the same region for all the different types of environments. It's important because there can be different services and different differences between different data centers in terms of the behavior, the performance, and so on. So we always recommend that you deploy all of your environments in the same geography and the same Azure region. So once you're kind of done with your environment planning, you've put this all together, the next step is to kind of consider what needs to happen now, right? And application lifecycle management is really the next thing that you're going to want to focus on. We do have some links that we'll talk about a little bit later on that will talk more in detail about application lifecycle management. We're not going to dive into it very deep in this session, but make sure that you use your environment plan that you put together to help structure that application lifecycle management flow. And you're going to want to make sure that you're considering both your code movement between your environments and your data movement between your environments. So I've put together a graphic that is a very simple sample environment flow. And obviously, when you consider your environment flow, you're probably going to have more arrows and more details in it, depending on how many code branches you have. But you'll want to think about the flow between your environments, and you'll also want to consider adding in kind of timing into your diagram as well. But this is a very simple example to kind of help you get started and help you start to visualize and think about this and what might need to be included in your environment flow. We start at the bottom, right, in our development environments always, and we generally move up through our test and into our production environments. Your environment plan may have more environments, and you'll want to make sure that all of those environments are included. Now in this diagram, you can see the left column shows the F&O environments, which are dev, test, and prod. And then in the middle column, we have project operations or human resources. If you're in an environment or a situation where you're actually deploying all three, finance and operations, project operations, and human resources, it's important to note that you'll actually have three different databases that are the same kind of infrastructure and a kind of platform, if you will, that finance and operation uses. So one DB for finance and operations, one for project operations, and one for HR. Now, when you're using project operations and HR, a CDS is required. However, we don't require a CDS with F&O. It's an optional feature that's there that you can use with dual write and virtual entities, which I think offers lots of great functionality, but it is not a requirement. It's an optional feature. with project operations and human resources, you will have to have that CDS and those CE apps. If you have customer engagement apps such as sales or customer service or field service would be installed onto that CDS. Now, you could choose to install sales or customer engagement, any of your CE apps on a separate CDS than the same CDS that's being used for F&O or project operations. So you'll need to consider that carefully as well. And what makes the most sense for your project. Project operations and HR are also additional applications that are installed on to that CDS, or can be. And then if you're also developing Power Apps, Power Automates, anything kind of Power Platform related, those would go into that CDS environment as well. Now, looking at the bottom, and you can see that kind of repeats for the test environments, but looking at the bottom row related to our dev environments, we have dev environments for customer engagement applications and project operations. However, there is no such thing as an HR development environment or a human resources development environment. If you do want to extend your human resources environment, you're going to do that by creating Power Apps or Power Automate, for example, in the Power Platform. And you still may want a CDS dev that is for HR purposes if you just have an HR environment, but it's not a HR specific database. It would be in that CDS. So hopefully this diagram kind of helps explain a little bit of what that relationship is, how many actual databases are sitting out there, and you'll need to consider kind of how dual write and virtual entity will play in and how all of your apps will play together. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Peter to walk through our checklist and resources and wrap us up today.
Thank you, Rachel. Now let's take a look at sample checklist. So here you can see this is a sample checklist that you can leverage in your real project. You can customize the content based on the real project needs to assess your knowledge and help you on the environment planning. So you can see here in F&O aspect, whether you have understood different tiers, whether you understand different options for tier 1 deployment, etc. And in case that your project need to integrate between F&O and CDS, then here you can see some checkpoints related to CDS also. Okay, next, we would like to share some additional resources that we didn't cover in this tech talk, like licensing aspect. You can refer to the licensing guide, and the others like online service terms and the SLA. You can download those documents after selecting the language. And for others, like the bottom, you can see some the other tech talks for C and dual write. So if you are interested in how to integrate C with F&O, you can refer to those tech talks. Okay, that's all for today's, and let's move to QA. So we have received lots of questions, and we have tried to answer most of them, but we still have some didn't answer. So maybe.
Yeah, so I mean, there was definitely a lot of questions around the tier 1 environment changes. And the frequently asked questions page is up on the docs article. And if you have additional questions, I'm going to paste this into the chat right now. Additional questions should be sent to finoptie@microsoft.com. So if you've got specific scenarios, I know some people had some very specific questions around their credits and how that works. Please send those questions over to finoptie@microsoft.com. I pasted that into the chat. There was also a number of questions around kind of how build automation is going to work. And I know we didn't really have a lot of time to talk about that. I did post a link a little bit earlier into the chat about build automation. There will likely be another Tech Talk where we're going to deep dive into some of those topics in the upcoming months. So I encourage you to keep an eye out for that, and that will hopefully answer a lot of those questions that you had around that. A lot of your questions are great, and we're going to try to use these questions and get the frequently asked questions updated as well. With some of those questions and some of the questions that we didn't have time to answer today. But with that, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for today. Again, send those specific questions that you have to finupty@microsoft.com. And, keep an eye out for future Tech Talks, where we'll dive into some of these other topics in more detail. With that, I'm going to hand it back over to Evan to wrap us up and do our survey for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. Like Rachel said, we would like to get your feedback on today's session. I've posted a link to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We value your feedback and welcome your input on how we did today and what you would like to see in future sessions. That survey scores on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible, and we thank you for your participation in that. As a reminder, the recording of today's session will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenters and a thank you to our audience for logging in and joining us today. Please stay safe and have a great rest of your day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.